Well, welcome everyone. I'm Barbara and delighted to have you here for this second of our ongoing series, all about that place, participating with the Society of Genealogists in this wonderful series, focusing on stories about place, stories about home and the environment that we're in and how that helps us tell our family stories, going back in time and in the here and now. We have two very special guests here today. I'm delighted about, and we've had a little bit of a chance to chat amongst ourselves and get to know each other and the connections. And I look forward to their feedback along the way of what those connections are. First is artlyn Malio Johnson, who is a neighbor of mine here in Berkeley, California, but right now with her family in Florida, with a family gathering she can talk a little bit about in the context of her presentation about her grandmother's garden. And as she was telling me about this garden and the place this garden has in her community and her family, I think is very important and a wonderful story to be told. Ed, meanwhile, joins us from New York, where he shares some of his deep experience and perspective in the landmarks of New York and their unique history to the people who have lived there through the centuries, which, interestingly enough, was my birthplace as well. So we're going to go ahead and kick that off. Artlyn, do you want to say a few words?
Number one, thank you, Barbara. This is, we've been trying to do something together for a while. I am one of the family's genealogists. I actually do two sides of my family for about 18 years. I've been doing it. Presently, before I get into my family, I just want to wish everybody a day to reach out to your family, however small they are, or big they may be, just like reach out and say hi and just connect, I'm here doing that with my family. My background is I'm a herbalist, I'm a community healer, I do preservation work, I do land stewardship, all these things. And, all these things came from where I came from, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. And my story today is about my grandmother, Naynee, who was one of the last granny midwives in Central Florida. She was well into her 80s, still birthing babies in 1983. So we can start with the presentation a little bit. I'm at a gathering today where somebody described our family as not as a legacy, but a dynasty. and it's kind of true. Everybody got something from Naynee. Naynee was born Mary Jane Hill in Georgia. She was born to sharecroppers, and early on in her life, she had I think my grandma had a fourth grade, fifth grade education. She worked in the fields, but she had healing hands, and she learned from her grandmother. And probably when she was a teenager, or maybe even before, when she was a teenager, doctors used to come and look for her because they needed help birthing babies. And she had the hands, and she says she had God's hands, and he gave that gift to her. And she was quintessential grandma, she she really was. We used to come up from South Florida and run into the house on Vineland Road, which used to be, when my dad and his family, my dad has 7 brothers, he had a sister. When they grew up in that house, it was the country. It was not Orlando metropolitan city. It was not. They lived in the country. They lived in swamps and orange groves their entire life. And that house that my grandparents have was a birth center. My grandmother used to bring the mothers there to the house after birth and sometimes at birth, so that they could give birth there in the house upstairs on the second floor. And she had a medicine cabinet in her yard, and she used a lot of the medicine that was in her yard. And we've got, oh my God, there's so many stories about a couple of the medicines. I mean, there's an orange tree in the backyard. There's a hibiscus. She had a saw palmetto, the yam. She used to even use the Spanish moss off the trees. She's an elderberry tree right next to her window. I know I caught her more than once taking elderberries off of the tree from inside of her room in the house. You know, she'd make elderberry wine. She'd make elderberry syrup for the cough. She'd also make it to give it to the mothers so that they could perspire. Okay.
Advance the slides.
Yes, you may. You can just advance them at whim, because people can see them. You know, they don't have to. You know, I'm not talking at a slideshow. I could just. Okay. These are kind of my cue cards right here. That is actually a picture of the front yard. Picture of the house. This house is actually now a landmark designation in the city of Orlando. And the family is looking to do a lot of historic preservation on this site. That garden in the back is filled with so much medicine and so many native habitats that it's sometimes it's a little bit unruly. So we've got a live oak, and we've got lots of course, Spanish moss. That's that elderberry. The thing about the Spanish moss that I know is that it was used for a small amount of time as a foot wash, a bath for the feet. If you had anything like open cuts, sores, or anything like that on your feet, Spanish moss in a tub. But you have to make a tea out of it first, and then put it and soak your feet in it for that. There's a really awesome medicine there. I think it might be at the next slide, and that is called wild yam. Let me see. The wild yam's not on this one, but the wild yam is number 3 on here. Wild yam is a serious, serious medicine. If you don't know about what the yam and the root does, this is actually an air yam. And there are 2 kinds of yams. There's one that you eat, and there's one that you don't eat. And if you know anything about medicine, you know anything about nature's medicine, yeah, the one you don't eat is usually the one that is the most potent. It's the one that is going to probably be a panacea of everything. The wild yam that I know that she used was for, number one, for a wash for the mothers, because it was, so to speak, it helps relax the muscles. Okay, so if you're in contractions, you have a problem with contractions, you either mash it up, give it to them in that form, like cook it, mash it, give it, or back in the day, as the midwife that she was, she could mash it up and put it in the area that it needed to be put in to relax those muscles, so to speak. Interesting thing about yams are that they're what birth control pills were made from, or what do they call it, synthesized from, something, because they make progesterone. It's already, and it's also used as to clean to make a, what do they call it? They call them stitch baths now. To clean the the mother and the baby would get cleaned in a combination of a poultice, or you can actually make a tea out of it too. You get washed in that to clean up the afterbirth. Saw palmetto is if you know about herbal remedies or you know about herbal medicine, well, saw palmetto is what's considered man's medicine. We'll say that. It's the man medicine. Whatever man problems man have, just like women have black cohosh, okay. Saw palmetto is for men, just like black cohosh is for women. It also aids in digestion, and it helps you. It helps if somebody is not eating enough and they're wasting away. Saw palmetto is good for that. So it increases the function and the activity of the reproductive system for both the man and the female. Usually females are not taking saw palmetto, and the man takes the saw palmetto. So it's good for the prostate, it's good for the testes, it's good for the mammae, it's good for the uterus, it's good for your ovaries. So even though it's good for as a reproductive plant, but 9 times out of 10, if grandmas or medicine men or whoever see it, they're always going to say that's man medicine right there. That's male medicine, not female medicine. All right. Let's see. I got a funny story about the hibiscus and the orange. But hibiscus, if you know about hibiscus, some people call it jamaica. Jamaica is good, actually. Hibiscus is good for your high blood pressure. If you have high blood pressure, it brings your blood pressure down. It's also a good tonic for your system. It's a diuretic, and it just tastes good. I mean, really, it tastes good. It's a good alternative to black tea or caffeinated anything. Hibiscus coolers are in the same picture that there are oranges. I have a story about those oranges because those look like oranges, right? Oranges, this garden is in Central Florida. So this place, it used to be just orange groves all over, orange groves and swamps. So oranges were actually used, we use those daily and we don't notice it, but those are energy tonics. That's what oranges do. They give you energy. And so if you're in labor and you are trying to bring a being into the world, then at some point you're going to be tired. So that energy tonic, that orange was used for that. But the story about those oranges on that tree, and they look like oranges, but actually they are not technically oranges. My great uncle, Uncle Bud, this is my grandfather's brother, was a horticulturist at Orange Groves back in the day. And he spliced that tree with a lemon tree. And so when you go into the yard and you think you're going to pick an orange and you think you're going to have this lovely orange taste, it's not an orange, and you spit it out because you're thinking you're going to have an orange, and it's actually kind of a combo lemon orange kind of deal. And it's not, it's a good prank to play. We've done it before. We do it all the time, every time we go over there. But they had a plethora of orange trees around, and between my grandmother and her brother-in-law, they spent a lot of time in that garden, in that yard. A lot of things they pulled out of the forest and they planted in the yard. And some things are just wild. Some things are just wild. The bougainvillea, I'm sure that was not wild. but that ear, I'm going to tell you about the ear pod tree because the ear tree is a interesting kind of it's an interesting plant tree. So that tree is native to the American tropics. It's native to the Caribbean. The Taino name is Guanacaste. And Taino and Arawak people were all the indigenous people of the Caribbean and the basin. Heads up to the Tequesta people and Seminole people also of that same region. That name Guanacaste has a close relationship with dreaming. And in African American traditions, though, they also called this tree the African dream seed tree. And so that pod that you see that looks like an ear, there are there's two stories happening with that tree. The tale that my dad likes to tell is that he said that his mom, Naynee, said that when the ears from that tree fell on the ground, if like one fell and it hit you and you were out in the yard and one fell, because I don't know if you can see that it's probably the size of, those are probably the size of my palm. Okay. They sometimes come bigger and they're hard, and inside they've got little seeds in them. If one fell on you and hit you as you passed by the tree, that means somebody was gossiping and they were talking about you. It meant a gossiping woman, because it's always a woman, it's not a man, right? Men's are not gossiping, right? They're not. It's always about a woman. The medicinal part of that tree is that those seeds put you in a state of lucidity. And when you are giving birth and you don't have anesthetics, anesthetics, this was used as early anesthetics, puts the mother in a state in which they can stay there long enough to go through that process, to move that being into the world. Wild, all the wild plants in the yard. Is there one more? Is that it? So my grandmother birthed close to 1,500 children, and she never lost a child. She never lost a mother. My grandmother, Naynee, when every child would come into the world, she would pray over them. She would sing to them when they came into the world. And I man, I wish it was me, right? She did give birth to two of her children, two of her own. Okay, my uncle Clyde, I think she birthed, and I think it was my uncle Curtis herself, right? This woman was, when you read that she says she won't quit, she was not going to quit. She didn't care. She didn't care. She was 82 years old, still birthing babies in this town. And she was just, she was there. Everybody looked up to her, and we did too. She came from really humble beginnings, and she did what she wanted to do. She did what she wanted to do for life, I don't know what else to say about Naynee. She was there's so many stories. 10 minutes is nothing. 10 minutes is nothing. This woman, lots and so many stories about how people repaid her. You know, she sometimes went out in the woods and stayed with people for like 2 days, you know, to help them give birth. People used to pay her in forms of all forms of currency. Okay, pigs, guns, dogs, you know, whatever, all kinds of currency, just to show her, give her thanks, you know. And I'm so humble to be her granddaughter and be here and be doing the same kind of line of work. I'm not a midwife, but I am an herbalist, you know, and I know the medicine of plants, and she gave that to me.
Forward to ways in which these kinds of stories can be passed on and honored. And I hope that that's something that this whole effort of respecting place and the people who are pulling and appreciating what the place delivers in the way of plants, and then people obviously delivering babies. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think we have you never know what the harmony is going to be in the combination of speakers, but here we have talked about the remarkable birthing of babies from a remarkable connection with land. And I'd like to turn to Ed Swierczewski, who will share with us his unique stories from New York and the historical connection to cemeteries and the past. Let me take this slide down and defer to you. There you go.
Well, actually, if you want, before we start, if people have questions for Artlyn, maybe now would be a good time to share that. By the way, thank you very much. I was totally engaged.
Oh, thank you.
I feel like she's my like
she was
grandma after hearing it, seriously.
Right. She's everybody's grandma.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, why don't we go on and we can bring this all together?
Yeah.
Conclusion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So welcome everyone. My name is Ed Swierczewski. I was born in Brooklyn and raised in Brooklyn. I live right in the next borough of Queens. So I've been to New York my whole life. Interesting just how the two speakers, right? Artlyn talks about people first coming into the world. I'll be talking about people departing the world. So we're coming kind of full circle here. My background is as a psychology professor. I taught psychology for 20 years in New York City universities. And I've been interested in genealogy for almost about 30 years now. So mostly first doing my own family research. And then ultimately I did open a business called Integrative Genealogy, LLC. And most of the work is doing things like this, where I do a lot of webinars and presentations, which is something I really love to do. So today's topic of, let me bring up the slideshow here. Okay, we'll talk about the sacred spaces and urban places, cemeteries of New York City. This particular picture is taken from Calvary Cemetery in Queens, looking westbound into Manhattan and New York City. And in the middle there is the iconic Empire State Building, literally right in the middle of the background. And to the far right, the one with the spiral on it, that is the Chrysler Building. And that the Chrysler Building is like about 42nd Street. And of course, the Empire State Building is 34. Now, we'll talk more about Calvary Cemetery in a moment. But we'll see now that the cemetery spread out all over New York City. And not surprisingly, of course, when settlers first came in, and in fact, the indigenous people before that, right, the way to do things back then is you were burying right next to where you lived. It's not as if you would travel like we do now. We could easily travel 1, 2, 3 hours to get to a burial place. Back then, people were buried literally in the backyard, right? Or the community equivalent. So when they started to develop, particularly Manhattan, they came up with upon the issue that there were previous burials in places where they wanted to do construction. And oftentimes what they would do is they would actually disinter the bodies and bring them oftentimes into Queens, which is an adjacent borough. Other times there may have been so much construction over it that they didn't realize that there was a burial site under it about 15, 20 years ago. And I'll show you this in the slides. They came upon an African-American burial ground while they were trying to do new construction. And ultimately that became a big issue in terms of, because that was in the middle of downtown New York. And they actually developed it into a national monument. So really, really interesting stuff with that. In terms of, let me go to the next slide here. In terms of the boroughs, just so that if you're ever looking for burials or births or for any vital records, okay, it's normally done by county, okay? So there's 5 counties in New York City, and there's also the equivalent 5 boroughs. So the county and borough of Bronx and Queens have the same county and borough name. However, once we talk about Manhattan, and in fact, when people talk about Manhattan, what they're really saying, most people just call it the city, right? So it's not New York City as a whole, it's just the city. That means you're going into Manhattan. But that county is known as New York. Same thing with Brooklyn. That's Kings County. And then the borough of Staten Island, which is down to the left and not the left side of the screen, is known as Richmond County. So when you're looking for any type of records, use the county name and not necessarily the borough name. Now, the map on the right, okay, that actually, there's a woman in the CUNY system, and I believe this was her doctoral dissertation. She actually went out and mapped all of the burial sites that were known or believed to have existed, and that comes out to 527 burial sites, all of them depicted on this map. Now, you may notice, like in downtown Manhattan, that lowest southern part, which is where most of the early settlers lived, you'll see like a lot of brownish ones, which means that that cemetery is no longer operational. There are cemeteries still operational downtown. There are a lot of cemeteries you could actually visit. So I work in one of the World Trade Center buildings. And of course, I'm literally right across the street from the 9/11 memorial. I literally see it every day I go to work. But just a street or two down, there's several different cemeteries that are typically attached to churches, which is, again, not a big surprise because once cemeteries were not kind of outlawed in terms of doing it in your own backyard, the next available area was literally in the church yard. And in fact, you'll see there's a lot of burial spaces today that are literally adjacent to different churches or other religious houses of worship. Now, as time went by, of course, and the population expanded, there needed to be more burial spaces. And what we see, I circled 2 spots on both maps. The one on the red oval, okay? I did it on both this way you can kind of get a sense of the borderline between Brooklyn and Queens. Notice that the borderline between Brooklyn and Queens is right in the middle of that oval. And there's a good reason for that. The reason being that back in the 1800s, they came up with a law that said, oh, you could only have X amount of acres for a cemetery, because at the time, cemeteries were and still are tax exempt. And most of those cemeteries are owned by non-profit organizations or religious organizations. So what those people that own the cemetery lands, okay, they said, oh, we can only have so much in one borough. So here's what we're going to do. we're going to spread our cemetery across 2 boroughs, and therefore we could double the acreage. Right? It makes a lot of sense, right? So there's, and in fact, that where that red circle is, that's called the cemetery belt. And I believe there's about 17 cemeteries located right on the border in that area. And in fact, I used to drive to work, and it's a lot of cemeteries. If you ever drive on what's called the Interborough Parkway or the Jackie Robinson Parkway, you'll see it's literally driving in the middle through cemeteries. The other circle, the one on the left, the green circle, that's actually Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. The place is huge. Okay, you can see just by the colored area that it depicts that one single cemetery was equivalent to almost half the cemeteries on the cemetery belt between Brooklyn and Queens. Now, before we talk further regarding the places of cemeteries, let's talk for a minute about why we even have these processes of basically respecting the dead and the various cultural aspects of it. And I want you guys to think about that just for a moment. Like, why are the living trying to do all these respect for and tending towards the people that just passed? And some of it's pretty straightforward, right? These are people that you lived with, you love, they're your family members, and you want to show that honor and respect to them. And then also, there could be religious or spiritual traditions that need to be followed. Okay. I don't want to get into that because there's so many varied traditions and so forth. But I'm sure that within your own family and within your own experiences, you've probably been involved in various types of events surrounding funerals. It wasn't until about 130, 40 years ago that there were funeral parlors. Okay. Here in the United States, as in many other places, the funeral was held in your living room. They took out some planks or a door, put it in the middle of the living room, went and got some flowers, right? That's where you get the whole notion of having a lot of flowers around. Okay, the flowers obviously were there to mask any smells coming from the corpse. And even today, I mean, we still oftentimes provide the family of the deceased with flower memorials that are sent to the place of the burial, or at least the potential funeral home. And so flowers have also been part of it. The idea of embalming also was something that is, again, about the time of the Civil War was when that became very popular, because families wanted their dead relatives who died in battle or died as a result of being around the battle. And let me be more specific about that. There are many casualties that were due to sickness and not due to combat. Okay. So they decided that rather than just bury them where they fell, that in some cases they'd be able to embalm them and send them back to their loved ones. Now, in the larger battles such as Gettysburg and so forth, that was not possible. There were just too many casualties, and then basically the land that they fell on became their burial place. Okay, but on smaller skirmishes, when they died outside of those main battles, oftentimes they were able to ship them home to their loved ones. So that's where that whole notion of embalming came in. And as we know, embalming fluid is very toxic chemicals to the environment. And in fact, nowadays, there's been a movement, and it's been around for several decades, of doing natural burials. And a natural burial means just that. We wrap you in a shroud and we bury you in the ground. No chemicals, no toxic agents, and your body's going to decompose naturally, and it will provide food to various other living organisms, and you're just part of that cycle of life. Also, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the change from, for example, underground burials to cremation or above ground mausoleums and so forth. And let me bring back our PowerPoint for a minute. Okay, so as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, the early history of New York City cemeteries, those first burial grounds were often, again, church affiliated in Manhattan. But then you also had what we call potter's fields. And those were burial grounds for the indigent and the unknown. And they began in the 18th century. So it was a way of the community being able to provide some resources to those people who literally either had none or they had no known connections with anyone. Now, the rural cemetery movement in the 19th century led to the development of those large landscaped cemeteries, particularly the ones that I was mentioning in Brooklyn and Queens. Those notable early cemeteries, which I have depicted here in images, the one on the left is Trinity Churchyard, and that is literally not too far from Wall Street. The Marble Cemetery, now, people are not buried in the marble walls, they're actually buried underground, but the marble walls contain the inscriptions of the names of those who were buried right before that. And then the old St. Patrick's Cathedral, which was not on Fifth Avenue back then. And again, it's your typical churchyard where the cemetery is literally in back of or on the side of the church. So in the 19th century, as New York City became more industrialized, the idea was let's get the cemeteries out into the outer boroughs and away from Manhattan. And they passed what was called the Rural Cemetery Act of 1847. The land areas provided park-like settings with landscaping, monuments, and families would literally go on picnic on day trips to a cemetery. And I know that's very different from our own modern way of thinking, where you go to cemetery, you say a prayer, drop some flowers, maybe put a flag, and you're there for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then you go. That's not the way it was back then. Back then, you would take the family, pack up some food, and literally go on a day trip and spend most of the day at the cemetery. And a lot of these cemeteries have lakes and benches and places like that to relax and just have some tranquil spaces. They became places for reflection and leisure, not just about burials. Now, some examples of these, that picture in the lower left is Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. I've been there several times. They actually give cemetery tours. They have catacombs where you could go on tours of those. And in fact, it used to be the site of one of the biggest battles of the Revolutionary War, which was called the Battle of Long Island. Now, of course, Brooklyn is on the western end of Long Island, and at the time, Brooklyn wasn't Brooklyn at the time. It was still considered Long Island. Mm-hmm. And long story short, the British had almost encircled Washington and his troops in Brooklyn. And thankfully, there was a lot of fog that night. So they were able to literally sneak out in boats and get over to Manhattan. And they just left a few people with the fires on and everything. So the British thought that all the Americans were still there. And then come the morning when they stormed in there, guess what they found? All right, nobody. It's Washington snuck them out through the fog that night. Now, Greenwood Cemetery contains 600,000 graves spread out over 478 acres. Now, to give you a little sense of that dimension, okay, the image on the right, the cemetery is in the foreground. And in fact, that's only part of the cemetery. And we're looking westbound towards Manhattan, right, or the city. So we see all the skyscrapers there. But Greenwood Cemetery, as I mentioned before, is a huge place. Now, a little trivia fact in case you ever go on Jeopardy. There are more dead people in Queens than there are living people. And let's not forget Brooklyn. There are more dead people in Brooklyn than there are living in terms of population. So Now, I'm just curious if you guys have ever been to cemeteries that are more kind of restful and leisurely rather than just, going there to say and pay your respects. Okay, yeah, great. Yeah, I see some head shaking. Yes, that's a wonderful thing. By the way, at any time, feel free to unmute and share your experiences with us. It's not just me, the talking head, but I'm certainly interested in anything you guys can share with us too. Gwen, thank you for sharing here. I found my RSA in Greenwood Cemetery. Okay, the lot and section number. Yeah, I have not been there. Gwen, where do you live right now?
California.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Seriously, I don't. My email is somewhere, but if you email that information to me, next time I go to Greenwood, I'll see if I can actually get some pictures for you. Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Yeah, yeah. Is there anyone else that would like to share anything? Feel free to do so. I think sharing information from you guys is just as important as listening to me.
I was just going to say that my grandmother and my aunt are all buried at Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis. It's a famous one. There's a lot of I think some famous people. I don't know, like important American people, but I just know them because the important American people of my grandma Sarah, my aunt, and my mother actually already bought her plot next to her sister and her mom. So we talk a lot about it. And
Sure.
with my parents, my dad's from New Orleans, and so we would visit his parents' graves all the time, play
Sure.
music. He's passed on now too, but so
Right.
with my parents, it was very much an outing, a family outing.
Okay, great.
Spend time.
Right. And just to mention now that you mentioned New Orleans, by the way, if you've never been to New Orleans, you say New Orleans. As soon as you go there and come back, then you say New Orleans. Yeah. One of the things about New Orleans is that the basic water level is actually high. So they can't bury underground. They actually have to bury above ground. And that's one of the very unusual characteristics of cemeteries in the Big Easy is that all the burials are above ground. And anytime there's flooding and so forth, normally that doesn't affect the cemeteries, although once in a while it does. Of course, one of the times that I went to New Orleans, it actually snowed. Okay. Oh. And that was actually like the first day of Mardi Gras. I was like, okay. I'm like, I'm not going to feel it soon anyway. So let it snow, let it do whatever it wants. But it was cold enough. I actually had to put my socks over my hands just to stay warm. So thank you for sharing, everyone. Let me get back for a moment to the PowerPoint. So obviously there's a lot of religious and ethnic diversity in the cemeteries in New York. The cemeteries, of course, reflect the diverse population, and many cemeteries have sections dedicated to specific religious or ethnic groups. Now, I mentioned a few cemeteries in the next paragraph. Suffice it to say that I could have added 5 more paragraphs with all the different names and everything, but the very idea is that many cemeteries either are specific to an ethnic or religious group, or they are where they don't even look at that and they accept anyone. And essentially, what I'm depicting on the bottom is, I mentioned earlier, the African American burial ground. And quote, when they first purchased that land, they wanted it to function as, quote, grounds as a burial place to bury Black persons of every denomination and description, whatever, in this city, whether bond or free. And that was back in approximately in the 1840s or 50s. The image on the left is an 1852 map of the African American burial ground. Okay. And then back it was like the 1990s, I believe, when they discovered it during construction, they developed it into the African Burial Ground National Monument in Manhattan. And to the right, that other image to the right is actually a visitor center and interpretive center. So not just talking about their deaths, but they actually depict how these people lived, which I kind of like, right? Because our role as genealogists, okay, it's not just to find the date and place of birth and maybe the of death and their circumstances. That's part of it, right? That's part of, getting the vital records and the data. But it's about finding out more about the person's life, bringing them back to life, giving them a voice in contemporary age right now, even though they may have died 100, 200, 300 years ago, right? That's our role as genealogists, to bring them back to life, at least to the extent that we can. The extent that we have available data, that we have available documentations, that we may have oral histories from our family that are carried down. Okay, so it's very good to see that we now are very respectful of all those previous ancient burial grounds. Although I have no doubt there are many places that they still have, they weren't aware of, that they literally did construction over those older grounds. So any other thoughts or anything at the moment? Okay, just want to check in, make sure.
I did want to add, actually, Ed, you talk about storytelling at the time someone passes. This is one of the reasons we think this whole category is so important to what we're doing with Project Kin. But on October 15th, I have the first of a brand new series starting called Forget Me Not, focusing on the whole how we go about memorializing those we have lost and looking at it from a variety of different perspectives. This series will be led by Jane Hutchin, who is a former reporter and television interviewer in Australia. So stay tuned for that one. Will be coming up each month beginning in mid-October, really focused on the same challenge.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. So, I mean, in contemporary burial practices, a lot of times, I remember years ago, you went to a wake and it was just the body laying there and everybody sitting half silent, staring at everyone else. Things have changed a little bit. For at least the last 15, 20 years, a lot of times now they put pictures, several dozen pictures of the decedent and the family. My mother passed recently. We actually did it. They had a slideshow, and the slides were shown in back of the casket, so you can actually look at the slideshow and then talk about, oh yeah, we did this then, and here's the event we had, and this is what happened. You actually get to converse and share those stories at that time of the wake, which is, to me, it's an important aspect of that whole process, that whole bereavement process. You want to be able to share those stories and share the bereavement with others. And oftentimes my sense is that people who don't do that, just take, that you keep that in there. And I just think that creates a whole lot of other issues over time. But then again, I'm a psychologist, so that's the way I think. But I honestly, the bereavement needs to be expressed in positive ways, and in ways that, as Barbara's talking about, developing those stories and those histories and all of those oral histories in your family. Let me make this suggestion: start writing them down, or at the very least, tape yourself. Or you can go on YouTube and tape yourself, and then save it, and then pass it along to people. Right? You don't have to have any sophisticated movie cameras or anything. Right? Use your own iPhone or whatever phone.
Exactly. So, that's what we're all about here.
Yeah.
Capturing stories. The most important thing is to tell the story.
Yeah, telling the story. Absolutely. So let me go back. We're almost done with the slideshow. So what are some of the challenges facing cemeteries now? Okay, not surprisingly, right, there's space limitations. Right, a lot of cemeteries are nearing that capacity. Right, there are now more aware of the environmental concerns, where cemeteries contribute to the urban water management issues and may also face flooding issues. Right? Maintenance. The aging cemeteries require significant upkeep, and they're often relying on limited funds or donations, especially if there's no capacity, so there's no new flow of funds coming in. And then there's also a change in burial practices over time, particularly over the last 20 years. Okay. Interest in cremation and green burials is shifting how cemeteries operate now. So the bottom image on the left, of course, is a typical cremation. I actually went to a cremation once with one of my friends, his father. And these crematoriums are really like, they're like out of a Gothic novel. That's the best way I can describe it. Okay. And you're waiting to see like Abby Normal come out of the secret back stairway. But no, I'm absolutely serious. It's really Gothic stuff. Now, interestingly, the statistics for cremation, okay, in terms of percentage of U.S. persons cremated, in the year 2000, it was about a quarter of it, like 26.2%. And over the last 20 years, or approximately, right, at least up to the data from 2020, that has risen to over half, to 54.3%. So over half the U.S. population is now choosing cremation. And I looked at those statistics and I asked myself, I wonder what is driving that. And what I suspect the driving force is the funeral expenses. Okay, there's no doubt that cremations are much less expensive than your traditional burials with caskets and plots and so forth. Now, additionally, in addition to cremations, there's now something called aquamation or aquablation. There's several ways that they pronounce that. Basically, it's water cremation. And that on the right, the image on the right, that little tank, that silver tank, they put the body in and then they use water. And I forget, there's one or two other natural chemicals that they put in. And about 20 minutes later, they literally, the body decomposes and gets flushed out with the water, basically.
Interesting.
Now, the other choice you have, okay, and again, the other traditional choice would be like a burial at sea, but normally that occurs if, for example, in the military, they still bury sailors at sea. On cruise ships or something, they literally have a place to put you in the refrigerator until you get back to port. Oftentimes, because the family might think that there was some wrongdoing and they're going to want an autopsy, right? Yeah, funny how many wives get lost overboard while their husbands were in the cabin. I'm not going to comment on that. I'm just joking a little bit. But make sure you're going with the right people on the next cruise. That's all I got to say. Okay, the other new trend, which a lot of people never even heard of, okay, this is a good one. You can take your ashes after the cremation, and there's a company, I forget their name, but it's pretty easy to find if you're looking for it. They will take your ashes and they will launch you into space.
Whoa.
Okay. And in some cases, you get the Earth orbit option where the space capsule goes up, and then as it comes in, it gets basically burned up in the atmosphere, and your ashes are spread out in the upper atmosphere of planet Earth. Okay. There are two other options, by the way. You can choose the lunar option. The lunar option is just like it sounds. They pack you in with a few others, and you're going for a trip to the moon. Literally to the moon.
One-way ticket.
One-way ticket to the moon. That's right. That's right. So when people look up and it's a full moon, they could say, "Oh, Uncle Joe, he's right next to that crater." Right? No, seriously. Then there's a third option, right? Again, particularly if you're into space travel, science fiction, or you're a Trekkie, or like other types of space adventures, they could put you for the intergalactic option, which means you're going out to places where even the Starship Enterprise hasn't gone. Okay.
Right.
And surprisingly, yeah, I want you to take a guess. How much do you think it would cost to go into the Earth orbit one? Just out of curiosity, how much do you think that would cost you?
$54,000.
Hundreds of thousands.
Okay, 54,000, hundreds of thousands. What if I told you about $12,500 will get you and your ashes into orbit? Seriously, that's. I just looked this up like a week or two ago. The Earth orbit one was like a little over 12,000, I think, and I think the lunar one was like 18,000,
Wow.
and the other one was just a little bit more. When you think about it, $12,000 compared to a traditional burial with caskets and buying lots and so forth, there's not much difference in price, actually. Seriously. And I think particularly for people that kind of look at that as, wow, that sounds cool, like I'm going to be spread out amongst the universe or in orbit, that does alleviate the problem of use space here on Earth, right? And it also eliminates environmental problems because apparently the company says that all of their operations are environmentally friendly. So someday you may choose to take that big step, space, right? Your final frontier, right?
Right.
So does anyone have any questions or thoughts? And in fact, I see there's some in the chat. Let me just share what I'm seeing here in the chat. So Gwen mentions, I noticed that in my area of California, the largest cemeteries run more as a business, and you can't really go in and visit unless you're directly related. We have had vandalism of early settlers' graves at the Mission Cemetery, so that one is closed too. Yeah, unfortunately, I've seen that here in New York too. There's vandalism, and most of the time they blame it on like teenage kids going in and drinking and then just creating havoc. And that's a shame. That's a shame to see that. Okay, so Barbara says, is this Northern California? And Gwen says, no, Southern California, San Diego. And Barb mentions, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area and heard this kind of problem in Palma, which like please work on more people. Okay. Has more people dead than in homes. These are periodic issues of vandalism, and that type of desecration is very sad. Yeah, I agree 100%. And Gwen has a emoji, and they can also, thank you for mentioning this, Denise. They can also create a man-made diamond with the ashes. I totally forgot about that because when we went to the funeral home for my mom, they actually showed us a brochure and said, do you want, what size diamond would you like for mom? Like, what do you mean? It's like, no, it's not for her, it's of her.
Right.
So yes, they can create diamonds from the ashes of your loved ones. That is a little bit pricey. But again, it's still another option for people who think that that's appropriate. All right. So let me ask, does anyone have any thoughts or questions? Hindi, is that the right way to say your name?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
That is perfect. Yeah, Hindi. I have actually a question for both of you, but I'll pose it first to Malio.
Sure.
And have you, since midwives, I think it's interesting that midwives are like shepherd people into the world and out, I think, or maybe there's another word for midwives that is it like midwifery or midwifery and midwifery? So they kind of, it's like the two sides of the coin kind of thing.
They call it something different. They call it like the new thing. I know that the Greek term is doula, right? So the doulas, but like doulas, like midwives, are there for the beginning and they're there for the end. But see, the midwives only get talked about in the beginning. But so now they have something where they call a death doula, right? So they are not talking about bringing the people into the world. They're talking about shepherding and helping people go out, you know. And I actually don't know any person in my periphery that does both. They either do one or the other, because we're not living in our indigeneity, you know, because we live in the industrial world now. And that's a tough job for a person in this realm right now. The planes that we live in, you know, the what do we, you know, the matrix we live in now. You know, for the people who live out the matrix, I'm sure somewhere in some village, someplace, there's that lady. You know,
I have seen a lot more of the hospice play a role in the end of life experience. And I think death doulas in various forms are morphing into some of the roles for hospice. Hospice has a now infrastructure that relates to palliative care and access to things like morphine and other kinds of medications that may not be helpful in the long run, but can be greatly ease pain through a final transition. And personally, I've been very near that and am a big supporter. So I think all of the kinds of ways in which we culturally come to terms with really what has a long tradition behind it. These are the ways in which, quite frankly, I'm delighted to have the two of you, Artlyn and Ed, participate in this discussion as we relate to the very human, very analog world that we little bag of bones deal with as we as families and cultures come to terms with the physical manifestations of what we have, you know. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I want to be very careful with my twitchy finger. I blew it earlier. I want to make sure that we have a chance for conversation, but keep our recording to a tight hour so that our participants online can enjoy that. I will be capturing notes and record and references that you all have made here and background that Artlyn and Ed have shared with me earlier, and include those in the notes as well, which will be accessible from all about that place materials, as well as the Project in AATP 24 page as well. Any last comments before I end the recording? But you are all very welcome to stay.
Yeah, actually, Bob, I was just going to suggest that once you stop the recording, I'm more than happy to stay a few extra minutes to chat.
So that's after party.
Yeah, the after
yes,
party. Right.
exactly.
After party.
Yeah. Okay. So you all now see what you're missing.
Yeah.
I have another question for Ed, if I can.
Sure.
Let's keep it on recording. Go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So, in your experience in working with cemeteries, what has been some of the strangest things people have either put into the coffins or taken away from the cemeteries? That's what I want to know, because we collect goofer dust in my family. So what do people take away? You have to be like, put that back, please.
Well,
glad I caught this on the video.
I know that people have taken headstones. Yeah.
Headstones?
Yeah. Just like grab the whole stone.
Somebody else's headstone? Come with me?
I don't know. Like, I know you bring a little red wagon with you to pull it with. I don't know how people do that. And of course, maybe not now, but as we all know, back 150, 200 years ago, medical students were trained with cadavers that were actually stolen from the local cemetery. Okay, yeah. Now, the strangest stories I've heard from New York where undertakers claim that they're burying the body and they don't. And I'm not just talking about during COVID. This is like scams that they were running.
Scams. Okay. Yeah.
Also, another scam would be, back in the old days, people would leave like the wedding rings and other jewelry on the deceased, and they would just wait until everybody's gone, open it up, and just take the jewelry out. So nowadays, I mean, the best practice is you don't leave anything to, of that nature. You keep it for the family. Have you heard any weird stories yourself, Candy?
I was just gonna cook.
Yeah, I think I probably am the weird story.
Okay.
I had a coworker of mine. They're from West Virginia, and they're going back home because their grandmama was sick, and grandmama was going to scout a place in this beautiful cemetery. And I found out that that cemetery actually used to be a hush harbor for enslaved Africans, and served the whole African American part of the cemetery, one of the oldest ones in the nation. And I was like, I asked, I work in biotech, I do plant science, and I asked my coworker, I was like, hey, could you ask your grandmama to put some dirt from the African American side of the graveyard into this jar and fly it back to California? And he was like, okay. And because his grandmama was from West Virginia, this was not unheard of for her through her associations, and she did it. And it's sitting right there next to on my altar next to my father's picture. And actually, I have some for Artlyn I still need to send to her. Yeah. So
actually, I think that sounds perfectly natural if you ask me. No, seriously.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. There's one last thing while we're still on the recording. The latest trend, and this is from my social work colleagues, we now have social workers who are doing pre-death and bereavement planning for people's pets.
Oh, the new, that's the final frontier.
That's the new,
I mean,
that's
not
the new,
final frontier, but that's the new frontier.
the new frontier.
Yeah.
Right. So if you think your pets, they're getting on their final days, these people come in, they do start to actually give bereavement therapy to the person, and then they plan out the whole process for the pet. And the woman, I once went to a clinical symposium, and the woman that does it said it's not just cats and dogs, it's horses, cats. It's like any animal you can think of is subject potential to this. So in some ways, I think that's a nice idea, but I guess you need to have a lot of time and money on your hands to do stuff like that.
Gwen, did you want to?
I want to know about mort cloth. I heard about mort cloths in Scotland, but I don't know what they are. What is?
Please share.
Gwen, please.
I don't really know too much about them. I just know that I've seen it in I think it was they had to purchase them from the pastor, something like that.
Oh my!
It was like so I'm just like, what is this mort cloth thing? What are they buying and what do they do with it? It's like, do they put it over their face? Do they hold it in their hand? They have to give it back? I'm like, I don't know.
Right. Oh my God. Mort cloth. Buy it from a pastor. Only a pastor. You can't buy it from anybody else.
There's something about a business model going on here.
Yeah, that sounds like now also quickly in the chat, Portia says for the uber wealthy, it's cloning the pets. For example, Barbara Streisand.
Don't really go.
Now, I'll share this one fact for you, and it's a legal fact. If your spouse passes, you have the legal right to tell the hospital to harvest their DNA, as in sperm and ova. Seriously. So your dead husband and wife, you can still.
Is that New York? To your knowledge, is that a New York law or is it a
no? It's pretty much nation. I think it's pretty much a federal. Well, I'm not saying it is a federal law, but I know there are many states that do recognize that.
Wow.
Because at that point, it's considered literally the corpse of your spouse is considered your property. So you are allowed to tell them to harvest the DNA from them. Now, what will you actually do with it? Will you actually now, use that and produce a new child from it? I guess that's the idea at the time, but I don't know if that's creepy or if that's wonderful or kind of a little of both.
Well, I'm a big believer in organ donations, and if
Yeah.
something happened to me and it was not clear, I would be completely comfortable with my husband making those decisions. But when you start looking at what medical science can do with respect to cloning and certainly eggs and sperm and so on, eggs in particular, and where we
Yeah.
are with reproductive health these days, it does get messy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
I think maybe I need to allow for the after party to take on some of the more creative sides of
Okay,
this
yeah. No,
discussion.
you're right. Yeah, I agree. We'll
So
still be
let me
here. So
put an end
yeah.
to the recording for the moment. We'll come
Okay.
back. We'll have our own conversation now that we're all family here.
Yeah.
Thank you.